All right, welcome back. Let's open with a question from Abu. Is it new in the Bible, from the point of view of the Bible, or you mean as a theological concept? Is the Bible borrowing it from other cultures?
Yes.
Good question, thank you. Number of things to say there. First, of course, as you know, much of Scripture is playing out within given cultures, right? And much of the realities that are expressed, in this case, the sense in which peoples are constituted and represented, definitely has much to do with cultural resonances. And I say cultural resonances because I don't want to just see it as a question of borrowing, to say, I need to make this point, so let's look in the culture. It's too mechanical this way. It's more that within different cultures of the time, the kind of sensibility with which they think things and by which, as a peoples, they're constituted. The Lord, in His goodness, is revealing to us progressively deep mysteries of Himself through that, in that. So that revelation itself is being colored in the sense of being received, right, in those already existing cultural manifestations. That said, definitely what we're doing theologically is that we are trying to look, first of all, we see the Bible is affirming something that is not necessarily purely cultural. The Bible is affirming this idea that going back to Adam, or to the second Adam, that there's a deep connection. Now this is beyond any single culture, obviously. That there is one lineage for all of humanity in all the cultural complexities, across all time, and that this lineage is the very account for how we have the continuity, the spiritual conditions that we have now. There's something much more than just an account of what's our biological origins. And this is why there's a certain limitation, right, of how we could think about the continuity vis-a-vis the physical. But as far as headship goes, what we're really doing is going to be to look at various instances across Scripture in which we find the different expressions of the elements that we mean when we say Christ represents the new humanity, or Adam represents the all of old humanity. That there are different elements that come together, both culturally, but at the same time, those cultural instances are, let's say, extended also. And this is why I think, so for example, on this question, I think the best approach would be perhaps to do a sort of biblical theology of federalism, so that we're able to not see it as just as a question of borrowing and importing, because there's no one place where it's elaborated enough to satisfy what we're looking for, right? So, for example, when we said the moral dimension of solidarity, yeah, we can see it in some, for example, some instances of Israel's culture and the people of God. We can see as some instances. There are times too when you don't see it exactly, and that's why the continuity of the development and the various complexities, how different aspects meet in a biblical theological approach will probably be the best way to see it holistically, and then to read then in a robust way how Christ represents. Because it's not a one-dimensional category, this federalism. And this is why we try to proceed in this way. And now we're going to look at, we're going to call on different aspects in Scripture where we can see some of the angles, let's say, on this complex thing. So one is not a concept only, though as we're doing theologos, we're doing theology, we're trying to kind of lift out a concept, a kind of summary of the various dimensions. But it's not just a concept as such. It plays out in the way human history has been constituted. It plays out in the way our biology has been constituted, how God has made it, by the way. And it's really a rich concept. I'm not aware of, and if anybody knows any, it'd be good to look at it, but a good biblical theology of federalism or headship would definitely be something to explore. But let's look here. Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Now, this touches at questions of theological method, as far as I'm concerned. That as good theologians, we need to be first good readers of Scripture. And by good there, I mean good prayerful readers of Scripture. We need to be good thinkers as well. And by good there, I mean creative. Not creative by way of inventing new things, but creative by way of passing on the timeless truth, sometimes in new ways, in using new concepts. So sometimes there's the requirement to sort of, in a historical way, to do some kind of, somebody called it an archaeology of concepts. So you go back and say, okay, what was federalism? How can we, bring out what federalism means? And so you do that historical work. You bring out the living elements there. But then looking forward in terms of expressing it in a language, in a conceptual language that people can understand. Sometimes new categories need to be invented, new theological categories. Especially when people can absolutely not relate to the said concept. A kind of updating of the language, and I want to be careful as I'm saying this, because I'm not speaking just for a sense of novelty. Speaking for a sense of the way it's conveyed. The pipe, the content being still the same. But sometimes there are rusty pipes that need to be changed. Now, that changing might mean helping people to historically get back to something, and that's necessary sometimes. Like in this case, I think there's a sense that we shouldn't just give in to modern individualism, that we need to challenge the context to think, in a sense, to recover thinking collectively as well. That challenge has to be done, especially because there are many competing, and meantime strongly atheistic, frameworks that are trying to meet that need, i.e. Marxism, for example, trying to recover the collective. The collective aspect of humanity is something perennial. In other words, it's something that's always there. And it's unfortunate when it's lost. However, it's not just a collective framework, right? So we need then a concept that can say, to understand how original sin passes on, you cannot just always be a typical modern individualist. Otherwise, you miss it completely. You'd always think, why should I be tainted by something I never had any idea of, right? So you have to challenge that. But at the same time, we have to invent other perhaps ways of saying that. So for example, even this biological unity and continuity, it's more orthodox to speak of a single human history now than just multiple biological histories. So that's a good development. If you're in the 18th century, you'd have had to fight that, right? You'd have had to fight that precisely because you want to bring this point out. So these are the kind of interactions that theologians are going to have to make, even not just theologians, pastors as well, because you have to be aware of how the people are thinking about the concepts you're using, how they're receiving it. If something is so disconnected that they're like, what's federal? What's that about? It doesn't make any sense. To me, it's just me born in my own immediate family. That's it. I think in Africa, we're still very much in the collective mind, but of course with lots of nuances, different. We're increasingly modernized and westernized in that sense. Even in the West, depends on where you start. I mean, this individualistic sense has not always been, right? It's largely a story of modernity. It's not always been the case. The way of thinking about human beings mechanistically and atomistically, individual things standing separately, that's very new. We always thought about it organically. Anyway, good. So let's look at some instances here. The objections, it's impossible, that goes to your question, to see how Christ, who physically descended from the fathers and from, I've passed that. In Scripture, let's see this angle on federalism. Could somebody please read 1 Corinthians 12, verse 26? First, what that is highlighting is, of course, the spiritual interconnectedness, the spiritual unity, the spiritual connectedness in the sense of it's one body even though there's several parts. And so the life that flows through the one, the same life flows through all the members. In that case, the outcome, the suffering of one is the suffering of all. The honor of one is the rejoicing of all. There's a very significant word you find developed a lot in the church fathers that is responsible and needed many times for explaining the kind of integration, the kind of unity we're looking at. And that takes us beyond just a physical, biological unity. And this word is the word oikonomia. Economy. Don't think finances, man. Oikonomia. What's the Greek word for house? Now you can see the connection, right? So, okay, now you know what this word means. So what is it? The law of the house, the law that constitutes the house as a unit. The principle that unifies, that integrates, that weaves, that constitutes in the fundamental internal law that connects all of them and therefore runs through all of them. Very important word. Because what this is doing is that there's a sense in which physical biology constitutes a kind of biological economia. Yes, when you see it, that the biological itself, the principles that govern how life is propagated from one to the other, and how that life connects them, is linked by a certain law. It's not just random, right? It's not random. It's not random, right? The form remains, it's controlled. That's why you're not born with your forearms on your head, right? The law controls that with all the difference and variety should be here. There's a biological consistency. With the difference of individuation, there's still a principle that controls this biological oikos. In a household, in a kingdom, in a workplace, just name it, anything that is something of a complex system, but that's a system, so it means there's a law of integration that's holding them as a system. Otherwise, it's not a system. Otherwise, they'll be completely just foreign to each other. In a church, in any entity that brings together, there's a nomia of control, a controlling nomia. So in salvation history, what's the biggest controlling, supervening nomia in salvation history? Is the work of God across time and in history across time, in carrying out his purposes, right? That's what keeps it together. This is why we can read the whole Bible as the witness of one history of salvation. Even though it's so separated in time and culture by people who have no clue about. You read about them and we think we know them, but sometimes I try to imagine if I could, again, a time travel situation. I'm a big fan of time travel. But sometimes I think just me being thrown in with the children of Israel in the wilderness. And sometimes I try to imagine, to think if I can anticipate things, and I know it's not possible. And yet we're standing with them. So in this case, there's a different oikonomia. Think about covenants. Covenants. Say the covenant Jonathan makes with David, and how they cut that pact. and how they even implicate their descendants in their friendship. Promising to do good to you and your household, even when I'm no longer there. Another example. Think of the covenant God cuts with Abraham. Better example. What are some of the features? Is it just for Abraham? Is it only for this one man, Abraham, this blessing? No, it's for all his generations after him. He said to Abraham, I have sworn with an everlasting covenant. Think of other examples of covenants in the Bible. Now, we're talking oikonomia, right? We're talking that there are other ways of constituting togetherness that are even more powerful than biological physicality. Okay, let me anticipate where I'm going. That Reformed theology has moved in the direction of answering this question of connection, this federalism, understanding it covenantally, that the covenantal framework is the best framework to understand how the one head can cut something, cut a deal, can make an agreement, a covenantal agreement that binds the rest in its implications. Right? So that covenant becomes the best biblical. We were talking about, right, about how to think this. Okay. That covenants, as we see through the witness of Scripture, becomes the controlling theological framework for understanding federalism. And in that case, in terms of our parallelism between Christ, between Adam, first Adam and second Adam, we'll have what? The covenant of works. And the covenant of what? Luther. So, who's the mediator of this one? Who mediates this? Who stands? Who's the kaput? The kaput. The head. Capital, even chapter comes from that. Who stands as the representative for all? It's Adam, right? And who stands here? Christ. The second Adam. Okay. So, covenants as the controlling framework. Let's think a bit more of this covenant as this oikonomia. Let's think with it for a moment. Because this is one of the most powerful theological, and by that I don't just mean Christian theology, but theological stroke religious ideas. Because in whatever culture you look at, especially at the inception, you find this principle. You find that there's some kind of social contract. Now, in modernity, this social contract becomes taken as, it would seem, as a purely negotiated thing. Oh, we're the people here, we're going to do this. But it runs much deeper. It's first spiritual. whatever people group you see, even when they write their histories, it always moves back onto some kind of supernatural origin. Often it goes back to some kind of covenantal basis in which something is cut. And it's not for no reason that even in Scripture you find that covenants involve blood. Because it's not an agreement only. People break agreements. Even though there's an agreement. But it has the dimension of committing your very existence to it. So it binds you. It binds your existence. Just as some of the, it has been much studied, but some of the old covenants that were cut in the ancient Near East and which Abraham would have cut too with others, but when they would take one, most likely a ram, and cut it together and spill its blood and walk around it and dance around it, whatever. And then promise that let what we've done to this ram be done to me if I break it, if I break our covenant. You see, so life gets in there. And remember in Leviticus, the life of the flesh is in the what? The blood. So the covenantal basis for thinking the sense in which the representative, federally, as head, stands to decide things for the whole body is not at all strange, but it has to be unpacked. We're not just taking concepts saying federalism in a banal sort of political way now. Is Ethiopia a federal republic, by the way? Right. So is Nigeria. So is the US. What's happening is that the states, or however you call the regions, sort of independence, have, to some measure, some autonomy, but yet there are decisions that are made at the federal level, which the head takes, that has all the implications, no matter how much you might hate it. There are decisions your mind takes too that your body might so hate, i.e. waking up at 3 to do your readings, and that everything in your members protests against. But alas, they have to move, right? But to be honest, many times the body wins, and you know that. But you get the sense. Look here at, when you eventually, if you've not read it yet, when you get to the reading, so I'll just say pay close attention to that section that said, explaining original sin, human solidarity. So that's the spread of sin chapter 2. Now, these explanations of the oikonomia were not said by Baving. These are my explanations. But definitely that's the sense to drive it. And then he gives different things to consider. So, for example, how members of a body can either be a curse or a blessing to everyone. So, the idea of this person brings shame on the family. Why? Because first they share a togetherness, they share an identity, they share a name. In fact, naming is another aspect of covenants that we didn't highlight yet. how in some of the covenants you exchange names. You give a new name to each other. And that name functions as a sort of open seal of identity with each other. And so it's not for no reason that when God blesses Abraham and establishes a covenant with him, he signs it by changing his name. Changing his name to reflect the terms of the covenant. So naming is crucial. There are many other examples, but let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the law of solidarity. Because we said that's a big part of this. Let's look at that. Let's see 2 or 3 instances where we find solidarity. Genesis 9:25. Somebody take that, please. Okay. So pause on that for now. Let me do 1 Samuel chapter 15. The obvious person should please read that. You get the repercussions, including in death, because you are standing in a certain solidarity. You're part of the tribal oikonomia, or the nation, the oikonomia of the nation. And so there you see in the sense of that solidarity, how the consequences carry. When you read the section, just pay attention to the number of scriptural references. But for the sake of time, I want to move a bit further. But you get the point. It's illustrating the same idea. Now, does this all mean that there's no aspect of personal transgression, of personal responsibility for sinning? Have we dissolved the individual in the collective? I hope not, because that's not the point. The point is to say how the individuals are organically interconnected, both in their origin, in their destiny, and in their fate, in their consequences. So in this sense, perhaps, I hope we've been able to begin to bring some light to the sense that we can think the connection in Adam, the federal headship that Adam has with us, and therefore that Christ has with us. Now, if we go back to our Romans 5. Good question. I think in those kind of instances, we can understand it as the sense of sin entering the camp. Because remember, precisely in the sense in which individuals also sin and can be conduits for corruption to the whole. That any time there was, so yes, federal headship, we have that in terms of representation in covenants. But we also have to think also the aspect of corrupting influences. So throughout Israel, for example, in the ceremonial law, there were different regulations for how to isolate those and practices that were seen as corrupt, as having a corrupting, soiling influence. For example, what? Lepers. The one who has committed some sin and how he had to be taken outside the camp until such time as he could be restored back to the body. Even women when they were on their periods, for example. All of this is not inconsistent with what we're saying, or with this example. Especially given that specific instance where, that very sensitive instance where they're at war, God is trying to use this to first reveal himself in his holiness to them, trying to show them how they have to be pure. And so one person bringing sin into the camp is seen as a kind of cancer. And so, but even in that example, what you still have is, first an isolation of the family. But then secondly, the isolation is precisely because it could be, if it's not isolated and taking care of that whole unit, it could be a bad example to others, and then it will start spreading. So the head could be just a single instance. The head could cause everybody to sin, and so the king was punished more severely and quickly, decisively. But in other instances like that, you have where a member becomes a corrupting influence. So the Bible, God's law in those cases, isolates it, punishes it. There's no indication that there's not another principle at work there. If you remember, a big challenge of the Israelites coming out of Egypt was the very real tendency at every moment for them to lapse into, and they keep doing this, don't they? Did you bring us out here to kill us? Is it because we didn't have other gods in Egypt? Blah, blah, blah. And so I want to underscore how sensitive that specific case is in terms of how the exemplarity of one, even if he's not the head, could so quickly spread. Yes? But so it doesn't negate this at all. I think you need to think of that instance as a corrupting influence by example. And his sin had already probably spread more than we're given to see. But yeah, we can talk some more also on this. We need to read that aspect quite carefully. I think the other thing, as a specific case, the other things at work there can refresh our minds on it. First, it means that there is individual sin and individual responsibility for sin. It's individual action. So again, we need to be careful that the federalism here, we're thinking about this in terms of original sin, right? We're thinking about this in terms of the carry through, the propagation of sinful natures, of inclinations, sinful inclinations, of everyone being born into the sin. So this doesn't erase at all. In fact, more strongly makes the point of God's punishment for individual sins, individual volitional sins, which makes me actually want to move on quickly to our last section on the nature of sin, because then we can clearly delineate, and it's a distinction we've been making since, it's not new, but to clearly delineate nature of sin and these individual sin being the moral, ethical breaking of God's law that always needs an active subject behind it. This, in fact, of course, in terms of guilt, that's the more operative, more immediately operative, consequential thing going on. That's the foreground, without, of course, denying the background of the nature, but that's the foreground. Let's come back to this nature of sin, and then we can wrap it up on that note. And where we'll make this, there's a classic, by classic, a more scholastic distinction often made between what they called peccatum originans, which is the originating sin, which will pertain to Adam, and peccatum originatum, which is the sin originated. We'll elaborate a bit on that.